Well, hey everybody, happy Wednesday or Thursday or Friday or whatever day that it is that you're watching this Devo. For me, it's Tuesday, and Tuesday was abnormally cold. I think I had minus 31 on my way in this morning. So I just want to touch base, go back to last Sunday in the sermon. If you were here or watched online, you know that we continue to work through Luke chapter 14. Jesus went to dinner at a Pharisee's house, and it was a bit of a setup, and we saw some things. We saw kind of the pinnacle idea of the time together, something that Jesus wanted to share to them that I just want to remind you of here today, and that was from Luke 14, verse 11. Jesus says, "For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." He goes after a big issue with the Pharisees, the guys whose house he's at, the religious leaders of that day. They were proud. They were proud of their perfectness, so to speak. They were proud of their religiosity, of looking better than the regular people that they lived around. And so Jesus went after that a little bit from his dinner time together. So we talked about that a bit on Sunday, but one thing that we didn't talk about is the opposite. I didn't spend much time on humility. So I want to take you as we go through a little bit of a walk through the Bible together about some verses around humility. Let me start with Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. Paul writes, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." So a list of 5 attributes, an idea of clothing yourself, what it should look like. You wear clothes, obviously, for function, but also for style and for an expression of who you are to an extent. He's saying, here's an expression of what it is to be a Christian, that you have compassion and kindness and gentleness and patience and humility. He also writes to the Ephesian church something similar. He says in Ephesians 4:2, "Be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love." We can't be patient if we're not humble, most likely. When we're not humble and when we're prideful is when we want somebody to do something that we want or the way that we would want it to be done. We oftentimes lose patience. We're not humble in those ways. In the book of James, we also see another valuable verse as he's going to quote back to a proverb. Here's what he says, but he, talking about God, gives us more grace. That is why Scripture says, this is a quote back to most likely Proverbs 3, verse 34, "God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble." Peter also writes of that same, he quotes that same look back at Scripture when he says, and this sounds a lot like a blend of what Paul said and what James writes, "All of you clothe yourselves," here's that idea again, "with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble." A great reminder, a great continuity of Scripture, as Paul writes in multiple places, as James writes, as Peter writes, this importance of humility. But it's not found only in the Old or in the New Testament. It's also found in some of the Old Testament passages, specifically one of my favorites from the prophet Micah, one that you've heard me say probably a few times, and a lot of people doing what I do. But it says, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." We will see that at the end here, the last passage I'll get to in just a little bit, but this idea of humility in our relationship with God, to walk humbly with Him, being led by Him, is important as we live out our lives. A couple more from the Old Testament, from the Proverbs. As you can imagine, there are a few about that, about humility. But 22 verse 4 says, "Humility is the fear of the Lord," not being afraid of. You probably can understand that. Humility is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom or knowledge. Humility is the fear of the Lord. Its wages are riches and honor and life. 3 things that he describes follow somebody who's who's living a life of humility. Riches. Now, that obviously could mean money to an extent, but I don't think this is a prosperity type teaching. It's just an idea of riches, of a quality of life. He references there about a life that matters, about honor, right? If you live a humble life, you'll most often be honorable or seen as honorable, right? I mean, think about the people who comes to your mind as someone in your life when it comes to humility. My hunch is that when you think of that person, you also think of them with honor as somebody who you value and appreciate. Another proverb, and this is a special one, I think, for me, one that my parents taught me and other people along the way, people that led me, especially on the athletic field or in other places similar. It says, let someone else praise you and not your own mouth, an outsider and not your own lips. Isn't that true, right? We've all seen an athlete after a great game tell the whole world how great he or she is, or boast about a specific play or something like that, instead of just letting other people do the kind or say the kind or encouraging or flattering things about you. Don't boast about them out of your own mouth. Again, my parents taught me that, and I hope my children have heard that a time or two from me. Couple more then, a similar idea back to the New Testament in Paul writing to the Romans. He says, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Don't think of yourself higher than you should. Again, let other people praise you. Don't even let that get into your head. Be humble is what Paul is saying. And then the last one is out of Psalm 25, verse 9, where it says, he guides, talking about God, he guides the humble in what is right and teaches them his way. For you to follow somebody, for you to be guided by somebody, it takes an idea of who's in charge, so to speak, of a humility that says, I know that God's way is what's best for me. I know that I need to be teachable for me to reach any type of people for God around me. And so I love that verse, and I'm just going to conclude with that one. Humility is such an important attribute. It's such an important way to live. It honors God and puts him in the right position in each of our lives. I hope you are able to come out, guys, especially. I hope to see you this weekend on Saturday at No Regrets, and the rest of you, I hope to see you Sunday morning, or maybe even see you online, so to speak. But I hope you have a great week as the calendar switches to February. We'll see you next time.